London in the year 1666 was a city that seemed alive, restless and swollen with tension. Its wooden houses leaned toward one another over crooked lanes, their beams bone-dry from the summer sun. The smell of pitch and smoke hung permanently in the air, for nearly every hearth burned with coal or wood. Children darted between market stalls, merchants shouted their wares, and carts creaked under the weight of grain, ale, and cloth. Yet beneath the noise there was an unease that clung to the people like a shadow. They had not forgotten the plague of the previous year. Too many families still carried the weight of loss, their doors marked forever by silence. It was a city breathing but scarred. By day, London bustled with a kind of desperate energy, as though trying to cover its fragility. By night, the city grew eerily still. Oil lamps flickered in taverns, and the narrow alleys sank into darkness so complete that even the bold hesitated to walk them. Fire was a constant danger, always lurking at the edge of thought. Citizens told themselves they were safe, that God's hand watched over them, but every crackle from a hearth seemed louder, more threatening, when the wind howled through the crooked streets. The river Thames divided the city, its waters both lifeline and escape route. Barges floated heavy with timber, coal, and goods from far shores. The docks swelled with workers shouting over one another, their torches bright against the night. But those same flames reflected ominously on the water, a reminder of how fragile everything was. Among the poor roofs sagged, thatch and timber patched again and again until they were more tinderbox than home. Among the wealthy, houses of oak and paneling stood proud, yet even they were not beyond danger. Fire did not care for rank or riches. The city was a maze built of fuel waiting for a spark. On Pudding Lane, where the air smelled of flour, yeast, and sweat, a bakery bustled with life by day and glowed with embers by night. Its ovens rarely cooled. Inside, workers baked until their clothes clung damp to their bodies, and the heat pressed against their lungs. The master of the house locked up each night, certain that his livelihood, like the rest of London, would greet the dawn unchanged. But the city was not unchanged. It was waiting for the breath of wind, the careless ember, the accident that would turn its narrow streets into rivers of flame, waiting for the night when the sky itself would burn red, and London would never be the same again. The night of September 2nd began without warning, as so many nights do. A restless wind prowled the city, rushing through alleys and rattling shutters. Overhead, clouds broke and scattered, leaving the moon to cast its pale light on sleeping London. In Pudding Lane, the little bakery's embers glowed faintly, the ovens still breathing heat from the day's endless labor. Most of the city slumbered, but inside that shop, danger stirred. A spark leapt where it should not have leapt, caught where it should not have caught. In a moment too small for anyone to notice, wood met flame, and flame became hunger. At first it was only a whisper, a flicker along the floorboards. The servants, half asleep, smelled smoke but dismissed it. London always smelled of smoke. Yet within minutes the fire had grown bolder, seizing beams, climbing walls, finding air to feed its rage. Shouts erupted, footsteps thundered. Buckets sloshed clumsily as men and women scrambled to contain what already outgrew their grasp. But the bakery was made of timber, as were the houses pressed tightly against it. One roof touched another, one wall leaned against its neighbor. The fire had found not a house but a city of kindling. Outside, the wind turned traitor. It roared along the lane, carrying sparks high into the night sky, dropping them onto rooftops far beyond the bakery. A single ember drifted, landed, and blossomed into flame atop a thatch roof down the street. Another found dry straw stacked in a cart. In seconds, the fire was no longer a house fire. It was alive, leaping with cruel speed, outrunning the desperate shouts of those who tried to stop it. Neighbors poured into the lane, eyes wide, faces lit orange by the growing inferno. Mothers clutched children. Fathers tried to drag belongings into the street. But the fire moved faster than human hands could work. Sparks rained from above, burning into hair, clothes, and skin. The air thickened with smoke until throats seized and eyes watered. Somewhere a horse screamed. Somewhere else a man fell coughing, unable to rise again. The church bells rang out, frantic, their sound carrying across the city. It was not the call to worship, but the cry of alarm. London was burning. And though many had heard bells for fires before, few understood how different this night would be, for this was not a blaze that would be doused with buckets and prayers. This was something greater, faster, merciless. The wind howled again and the flames answered. London was awake now, but too late. The spark in Pudding Lane had become a monster, and it was hungry for more. By dawn, the fire was no longer confined to Pudding Lane. It had become a predator, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, swallowing streets whole. The wind carried its embers like arrows, striking where it pleased, igniting homes before their owners even knew danger was near. The city awoke to screams, to the crackle of beams collapsing, to the choking stench of burning pitch and oak. From windows and doors, people spilled into the lanes with bundles clutched to their chests. Linen, silverware, whatever could be carried in desperate hands. The flames moved with terrible intelligence. They sought out weakness. Dry timber, open shutters, straw scattered in stables. Horses panicked, pulling against their reins until they tore free, galloping through the smoke-maddened streets. Dogs howled and fled. Families stumbled, torn between saving their homes and saving their lives. Mothers shouted for children lost in the haze, their voices breaking, their cries drowned by the roar of fire devouring all. Along the alleys, neighbors tried to fight back. Buckets of water passed in frantic chains, but the flames laughed at such efforts. Every splash turned instantly to steam, swallowed in the furnace that the city had become. Some hacked at their own houses with axes, trying to create gaps, to stop the blaze from spreading further. But the wind betrayed them again, hurling sparks across the voids they carved. Fire leapt effortlessly as though mocking their struggle. On Fish Street Hill, a group of men carried a bedridden elder on a pallet, his white hair gleaming in the firelight. His lips moved in prayer, though the words were lost in the thunder of collapse, as a nearby house fell in upon itself. Women sobbed as their belongings burned. Wedding rings and family Bibles swallowed whole. Children clutched dolls and clung to their parents, their faces streaked with soot and terror. The fire revealed no mercy. The homes of merchants burned beside those of paupers. Shops filled with spices and cloth erupted into towering columns of smoke, colors bleeding into the night sky. Barrels of tar and pitch exploded, sending showers of sparks that rained like meteors across entire neighborhoods. From the north and east, citizens stared in disbelief as the red glow spread wider and higher, painting the heavens as though the sky itself were ablaze. "London is lost," some muttered, voices trembling. Still others shouted orders, urged their fellows to flee, to abandon goods, to run while there was still time. But time was vanishing. Every moment saw another street consumed, another family left with nothing but ashes. The fire had no master now. It was a king in its own right, ruling London with flames and fear, and it would not be stopped. By midday, the city no longer resembled itself. London, proud and sprawling, had become a battlefield between man and flame, and the flame was winning. Streets that once rang with the sound of trade now echoed only with the crash of falling timbers and the shrieks of the desperate. The smoke was so thick it turned noon into twilight, a choking shroud that stung the eyes and burned the lungs. Those who lingered too long found themselves staggering blindly, coughing until their bodies gave way. Panic ruled where order had once stood. Families fled in every direction, dragging carts piled with hastily gathered belongings. Mothers clutched crying infants. Fathers pulled children by the hand, shouting for them to keep pace. Some carried cages with birds, or cradled dogs trembling against their chests, unwilling to leave even the smallest loved ones behind. Others abandoned everything, running empty-handed, consumed only by the need to survive. In the marketplaces, chaos reigned. Merchants wept as their goods turned to ash. Some tried to salvage what they could, loading wagons with barrels of wine, sacks of grain, or bolts of cloth, but the crowded streets snarled with panic, carts overturning as oxen and horses screamed in terror. People trampled one another in the crush, their cries drowned by the roar of fire sweeping closer. The law seemed to vanish. Thieves moved like shadows through the smoke, tearing jewels from the necks of fleeing women, snatching purses from trembling hands. Soldiers and watchmen, overwhelmed and scattered, could do little to stop the tide of fear. Some joined the flight themselves, abandoning duty for the hope of safety. Church bells rang furiously, but their sound was no longer a warning, it was a dirge. Priests carried relics through the streets, holding crucifixes high, begging God's mercy on a city undone. Some led their flocks in prayer amid the smoke, their voices hoarse but determined, until the fire claimed the very churches where they stood. Everywhere people looked to the Thames. The river seemed salvation, its broad waters promising escape. Crowds pressed toward its banks, surging so thickly that fights broke out for places on the barges. Families begged boatmen to take them, offering coin, jewelry, anything that might secure passage. The lucky ones drifted onto the water, their faces pale as they looked back upon the inferno consuming their world. Behind them, the city crackled and roared, a monster without conscience. Streets collapsed into glowing rubble, roofs folded inward with booming thunder. Those who had thought to stand their ground realized too late there was no defense left. The only choice was to run. London, their home, was vanishing before their eyes. The Thames swelled with humanity. Its banks overflowed not with tide but with people. Mothers dragging children, men staggering beneath chests of clothes or sacks of grain, the elderly carried upon makeshift stretchers. Every soul pressed toward the water, convinced that salvation waited upon its restless surface. The roar of the fire behind them grew louder. The sky above painted a furious red that seemed unnatural, as though the heavens themselves burned. Boatmen shouted, their voices sharp above the din. Barges and skiffs rocked dangerously as desperate crowds surged forward. Some threw coin into the air, begging passage. Others pressed rings, necklaces, or silver plate into the hands of captains, trading treasures for the promise of escape. Yet there were too few boats, too many desperate bodies. Fights erupted as men shoved one another, clawing for space. A child slipped from her mother's arms and tumbled into the river, her cry cut short by the dark water. The mother's scream carried, raw and endless, until even the fire seemed to pause in cruelty. On the river itself, barges drifted heavy with refugees. Families clung together, faces blackened with soot, eyes wide with disbelief as they looked back upon the city. Whole streets burned in waves of orange, buildings collapsing in showers of sparks. St. Magnus Church, once proud near the bridge, erupted in flame, its bells tolling wildly until they crashed from the tower. London Bridge itself trembled under the strain of fire devouring both ends. Amid the chaos, some found unlikely courage. A fisherman ferried group after group across, refusing payment, his small craft sagging under weight but returning again and again. A young boy rowed his grandmother to safety, his thin arms straining against the current, while embers fell hissing into the water around them. Not all made it. A boat overloaded with passengers capsized, sending dozens into the Thames. Their cries echoed as the current swallowed them, their bodies lost beneath the fiery reflection of the sky. On the shore, priests prayed aloud, holding up crucifixes as comfort to those unable to find space on boats. Soldiers tried to calm the mob, though their voices were hoarse, their eyes as fearful as the rest. Every glance back revealed the fire creeping closer, devouring warehouses along the docks, threatening even the river itself. Flames leapt from moored ships as tarred ropes and sails ignited, sending black columns of smoke spiraling upward. The Thames saved many that night, but it also bore witness to despair. For every life ferried across, another was left behind, pressed against the shore, watching their city die and knowing there was nowhere left to run. The river was salvation and sorrow. As the fire raged deeper into the city, its path turned toward the places people once believed untouchable. Churches had always been sanctuaries, their stone walls and soaring towers symbols of endurance against time, plague, and war. But on this night, even God's houses bowed before the fire. Streets glowed with a light brighter than day as flames reached upward, licking the heavens. St. Paul's Cathedral, towering and ancient, became the heart of London's sorrow. Its great dome stood proud against the red sky, but already smoke poured from its timber scaffolding. Workers had left piles of lumber and resin within its walls for repairs, kindling waiting for a match. The fire found it. Citizens crowded nearby, watching in disbelief as the beloved cathedral began to burn. Some wept openly, clutching rosaries. Others knelt in the ash, praying that the Lord might spare his house even as their own homes lay in ruins. Priests rushed into the building, desperate to salvage relics, manuscripts, and the gilded cross that crowned the altar. They carried armfuls of sacred texts into the street, their robes scorched, their eyes streaming with smoke. Yet the fire pressed harder, roaring with a voice like judgment. Then came the collapse. With a sound that shook the city, the cathedral's roof gave way, sending timbers crashing into the nave. Sparks burst skyward in a storm of light, and flames consumed centuries of faith in moments. The great bells, heated beyond bearing, tumbled from the tower and shattered upon the ground with thunderous finality. All across London, people paused at the sound, hearts breaking as though they themselves had been struck. Nor was St. Paul's alone. Church after church, parish after parish, succumbed to the inferno. St. Mary Le Bow, its famed bells silenced, fell in on itself, leaving only jagged walls. St. Bride's, St. Lawrence, St. Sepulchres, each became a pyre, Icons turned to ash, chalices melted. Tombs of the dead split open as stone cracked beneath the heat. The fire spared no altar, no steeple, no sanctuary. For many, this was the cruelest wound of all. Homes could be rebuilt, possessions replaced, but the destruction of sacred ground felt like a message from heaven itself. Some whispered it was punishment for sin. Others cried it was the work of devils. But most simply wept, hollow and lost. By night's end, the skyline was changed forever. Where towers had once risen in solemn majesty, only pillars of flame remained. The city's faith, once embodied in stone and timber, now smoldered in ruin. The fire had not only consumed London's buildings, it had consumed its soul. The fire did not choose its victims. It swept across London like a tide, erasing the lines that once divided wealth from poverty. In the winding lanes of the poor, where cottages leaned drunkenly over narrow alleys, families stood helpless as their dwellings dissolved into sparks and cinders. They had little to lose, yet what little they possessed, blankets, tools, a table, perhaps a single cherished heirloom, was gone in an instant. Mothers dragged barefoot children through the rubble, their cries piercing the night. Men tried to fight the blaze with bare hands, only to stagger back, hair singed and skin blistered. Their world was not just burning, it was being unmade. Yet only streets away, the grand homes of the wealthy burned with equal fury. Mansions lined with carved oak panels and filled with velvet and tapestries, ignited like dry straw. Paintings blackened and curled into nothing. Libraries filled with leather-bound volumes gathered over lifetimes became pyres of knowledge. Cellars of wine exploded one after another, the barrels bursting like cannon fire. Jewel boxes locked away in gilded chambers melted into twisted lumps of useless metal. The fire showed no respect for title or fortune. Gold and rags burned alike. Some of the wealthy tried to salvage their treasures. Servants staggered under portraits, chests of silver, even harpsichords, dragging them into the streets in blind panic. Carts heaped with belongings jammed the alleys, slowing escape until fire surged upon them and claimed all. One noble woman clutched her wedding gown, its silk catching sparks as she wept. Another carried her husband's armor, too heavy for her arms, until she dropped it and fled sobbing into the smoke. Among the chaos, distinctions blurred. A merchant's daughter clung to the arm of a chimney sweep as they both ran for safety. A lord shared a bucket line with dockhands until the flames drove them apart. For a few terrible hours, there were no lords and no paupers, only Londoners, each equally powerless before the inferno. And yet whispers spread that some fared better. Wealth bought faster horses, sturdier carts, safer passage on crowded barges. Those without means often had only their feet, their strength, their luck. Resentment simmered amid the smoke. The fire consumed all, but the cruel truth was that escape was not equal. Some fled toward country estates. Others fled only into the next burning street. Still, as dawn broke, the sight was the same for all. Possessions gone, homes erased, hopes turned to ash. For once, London was leveled, not by sword or siege, but by fire that cared for no man's station. In its eyes, all were the same. By the third day, the fire had grown so monstrous that whispers reached Whitehall. The king could no longer remain a distant spectator. Charles II, restless and determined, rode into the smoke with his guards, his dark eyes narrowing at the devastation before him. The city he ruled was being eaten alive. The air stank of pitch, tar, and despair. Ash drifted down like snow, coating his cloak as he dismounted. Around him, people froze in astonishment, seeing their king not in the safety of palace walls, but standing amid the ruin with his people. The mayor, exhausted and soot-streaked, met him with trembling hands. His voice cracked as he confessed the truth. They had tried, but nothing stopped the blaze. The buckets failed, the chains of men faltered, and the fire leapt every barrier they made. Charles listened grimly, his jaw tight. Then he gave the command that many had feared to utter. Houses must be torn down to save the rest. Fire would be fought not with water but with destruction. Soldiers and laborers were summoned, axes flashing in the red light as they hacked apart homes still untouched by flame. Families wailed, pleading for mercy, but the king's order stood. Better to lose one house than 100. Walls crashed, beams splintered, clouds of dust rising as fire breaks carved scars through the city. Still the fire found ways around them, the wind carrying sparks over gaps as though mocking the effort. Charles himself waded into the labor, rallying men, urging them to stand fast. His presence lent courage, for here was no distant ruler, but a man in the ash, sleeves rolled, giving orders with a voice that cut through the chaos. The Duke of York, his brother, joined him, commanding troops with fierce resolve. Together they tried to marshal order from madness. Yet for every gap they opened, flames devoured another street. The city seemed endless and the fire tireless. Rumors spread that foreigners had started the blaze, that spies had cast fireballs into homes. Some shouted for vengeance, hunting strangers in the streets. Charles quelled them where he could, his voice firm. The fire was enemy enough. But suspicion smoldered in the smoke, feeding unrest. Even as he fought to save the city, Charles knew they were losing ground. Entire parishes vanished overnight. Churches, halls, and markets lay in heaps of glowing ruin. The fire still raged, indifferent to crown or command. But the king's presence gave something that water could not: hope. And in those desperate days, hope was as precious as air. At last, after 4 endless days, the monster began to tire. The winds that had fed its fury slackened, and with them the flames lost their terrible speed. Where once fire leapt from roof to roof like a predator, now it smoldered, crouching in heaps of ruin. Buckets of water that once turned instantly to steam now hissed and lingered, dampening the ash. The roar that had drowned every voice grew quieter, replaced by the creak of collapsing walls and the faint crackle of dying embers. Londoners emerged like ghosts from the smoke. Their faces were gray with soot, their clothes torn, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They wandered streets they no longer recognized, searching for homes that were gone. Some carried buckets still, though their arms trembled with exhaustion. Others clutched what few belongings they had managed to save, set down now upon the blackened earth as though even survival felt too heavy to carry. The silence was not peace but shock. Where taverns once rang with laughter and markets bustled with trade, there was only emptiness. Whole parishes had vanished. Landmarks known for generations lay twisted and broken. The proud skyline of London, once crowned with spires and domes, was now jagged and skeletal. St. Paul's, reduced to smoldering ruin, stood like a tombstone in the heart of the devastation. The ground itself was treacherous. Ash drifted in drifts like snow, concealing glowing embers that scorched the unwary. Stone, cracked by heat, split underfoot. Smoke still rose from hidden corners, curling into the gray sky. The air reeked of burnt pitch and charred flesh, a stench that made even the strongest gag. In the wreckage, survivors searched for the missing. Mothers called for children who never answered. Husbands dug with bare hands through rubble, convinced they might find wives beneath collapsed beams. Sometimes they did, sometimes not. Priests moved among the ruins, offering prayers over the dead, their voices trembling as though even their faith had been shaken. Amid the despair, there were small mercies. A child pulled from a cellar, coughing but alive. A dog found wagging its tail, though its fur was singed. A chest of books, half-burned yet still legible, lifted reverently from the ruins of a library. These scraps of survival felt like treasures in a world turned to ash. And yet, as the fire's roar faded, another sound rose, the murmur of questions. How had this happened? Who was to blame? Whispers spread like smoke through the crowd. But answers were scarce and grief heavier than suspicion. For now London had only silence and the unbearable weight of loss. When the last embers cooled and the smoke finally thinned, the scale of ruin became clear. 4 days of fire had reduced the great city to a wasteland. More than 13,000 homes were gone, along with halls, markets, guildhouses, and churches. The ground was a patchwork of blackened stone and twisted beams, smoldering like the bones of some colossal beast. For miles nothing stood unscarred. Londoners walked among the ruins in stunned silence, their footsteps crunching over ash, their shadows long in the pale morning light. Yet even amid the desolation, life stirred. Survivors set up tents along the edges of the destruction, makeshift shelters of canvas and wood. Merchants laid out stalls on the bare earth, trading bread and ale where proud shops once stood. Children, too young to understand, played among the ruins, their laughter strange against the silence. Slowly, London began to breathe again. The king walked the wreckage himself, his cloak sweeping through ash as he spoke with the people. His words were heavy with sorrow, but also with resolve. "We shall rebuild," he told them, his voice carrying over the rubble. "London will rise greater than before." To many, these words felt like a rope thrown into darkness. They clung to them, drawing strength where little else remained. Plans took shape. Sir Christopher Wren, young and brilliant, unfolded designs for a city of stone rather than timber. A city whose streets would be broader, safer, and grander. Where fire had swept away centuries of crooked lanes, there was now space for vision. People murmured of domes and towers that would eclipse what was lost, of a city reborn not only from necessity but from ambition. But rebuilding was not only dreams, it was hardship. Families slept in fields for months, enduring rain and cold while waiting for new walls to rise. Food grew scarce and tempers flared. Accusations lingered, some blaming foreigners, others the careless, still others God himself. Yet beneath the anger there was determination. Londoners, hardened by plague, fire, and grief, refused to vanish. Stone by stone, brick by brick, the city returned. Streets widened, houses rose taller, and churches once reduced to rubble began to climb skyward again. Years later, St. Paul's would stand reborn, its dome a crown of resilience visible for miles. It would remind all who saw it that London had burned, but London had endured. The night the sky turned red would never be forgotten. It lived in memory, in scars and stories passed down through generations. Yet it was not only a tale of destruction, it was a testament that even when flames consume everything, from the ashes hope can still take root.